Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 6. This episode goes to 11, presented by Marketile. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, it's an important week for our two great nations. We're recording this on Friday. President Biden, the First Lady, just arrived in Ottawa for his first official visit as the U.S. President, talking trade and security issues. Easy question for you, Mr. Economics. Who is America's largest trading partner that doesn't float spy balloons over your country?
I mean, I was going to say Mexico, but I guess I'm going to have to say Canada.
Correct. Canada. Canada is the largest trading partner. Great to have President Biden visiting in Ottawa. So speaking of cross-border trade, later on in the show, we'll talk about the unraveling of Nordstrom in Canada. They officially went into protection, and now they're being run by their bankruptcy agency. They started their sales in the stores. All their vendors yanked out their stuff in the shop-in-shops. And the relaunch of a brand bought out by Target in Canada, Zeller. So we'll talk about that a little later in the show. Now, our very special guest on the show is Jarvis Sam, founder, CEO, the Rainbow Disruption. He's a Brown University adjunct professor, former chief diversity, equity, inclusion officer at Nike, Forbes 30 Under 30, ex-Snapchat, ex-Google, and a fantastic interview.
Yeah, you know, we've been, it's too bad it's taken this long, really, but we've been wanting to really showcase diversity, equity, and inclusion on the podcast for a while. It just took us some time to find the right person, and I think we did okay.
As folks are listening, we are here in Vegas at Shop Talk in the Wiseline Podcasting Studio by the Mandalay Bay Beach, and you're on the stage tomorrow dropping some knowledge. Our minds and travel plans now turn to Europe. Our next adventure is in Barcelona at the World Retail Congress.
We're worldwide.
Yeah, it's fantastic. You're on the stage there as well. But we'll talk about that a little later in future episodes. Now, for the folks who might be interested in joining us and some of the world's top thought leaders, Scott Galloway's there. He's been on the pod, and a bunch of other great folks that we're going to be chitting and chatting with. We're a media sponsor. We got an offer code. We'll put that in the show notes. Get yourself a nice discount to attend the show if that helps get you over the finish line of coming to such an event. All right, let's get into the big news. Let's start with the economy. I mean, last episode, very well received, and we talked about this. You know, things are starting to settle in, get more VUCA-ish, so to speak, and we're starting to see a little bit more of the implications, maybe, of the chaos that either created or was created by SVB. What are you reading in the economic notes and tea leaves?
It's, I guess, it just underscores this idea of there being so much volatility and uncertainty. When I was first making my notes after the Federal Reserve raised the interest rates 25 basis points last week, and Bank of England also did a similar move. A bunch of other countries took the interest rates up. My sense was things were starting to settle down a little bit, maybe the path forward becoming a bit more clear. But there still continue to be a bunch of unsettling news or concerns about where the banking industry stands, and the bond market's doing weird things as we record this. And so who knows? But I think, you know, the overall picture is that credit is going to tighten, which presumably should help with getting inflation down more. But inflation remains high. The job market remains strong. I think the UK reported 10% inflation a few days ago. So, so I mean, there's a lot of factors here that are still to be played out. And even though interest rates have gone up a lot, I think it's in the US anyway, it's 4.5% in, I think it's 9 or 10 months, which is, you know, pretty significant, but it hasn't done a lot to really tempt down demand and take inflation down. So we'll see what's going on. The last thing I was just going to mention as I was watching the news this morning is there's starting to be this narrative of, well, maybe actually we're going to be pivoting pretty quickly to some rate cuts. So it's just a very dynamic market. So it's I don't know, it's really in a lot of respects the craziest kind of macro picture. I mean, we've obviously had the financial crisis and post 9/11 and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of trying to read the tea leaves here, very difficult.
Quick hit on some earnings. Nike, Williams-Sonoma, and Swiss sportswear retailer On. Talk about what you're seeing from those folks.
Yeah, I'll make this really, really quick. But Nike's one of these brands we've been watching, particularly as they make their shift to more direct to consumer. They've got a lot of new formats that they've been piloting and expanding. So I think really fascinating study in general. They reported their earnings, which were surprisingly good, strong sales, better profits than most people thought. They've made some progress. Folks may remember or have read about Nike having a lot of inventory, mainly because of the supply chain disruptions. They've made some progress on that. They still got a ways to go on it. It hit their gross margin, but the trend is pretty positive. And this quarter still includes some real downside pressure from China, but with China opening back up, I think we'll see that business pick up. So surprisingly good earnings. Still a little bit of work to do there. With a few others, just quick hits. Williams-Sonoma reported very good earnings, and what's interesting to me about that is the home category has really been tough. They are people may know they in addition to the Williams-Sonoma specialty concept, they own Pottery Barn and West Elm, and the fact that they were running sales increases and good profits, I think, really defies the home category is impossible to do well in narrative. So really strong performance from them. On running or on the Swiss sportswear retailer, we talked a lot about the wobbly unicorns and some of these disruptor brands that have had challenges. Well, On is really defying that narrative. Now, they are a relatively new company in that they started, I think, in 2010. But they are on fire. They've almost like taken over the mantle from Allbirds, where Allbirds was the cool shoe,
cool kid on town, yeah.
Whereas On's become popular with entrepreneurs and kind of that whole Silicon Valley kind of crowd as well. As so more broadly,
their horn is more freshly grown, so to speak, than some of the other more grizzled unicorns.
Even though they are a newer company, and even though they've got this hyper growth, because their sales for the fourth quarter were up like over 90%. I mean, pretty impressive growth. You just don't see that very often. They have had a more balanced kind of manufacturer sort of strategy with a strong mix of both direct to consumer as well as a pretty healthy wholesale business. So I wouldn't necessarily put them in kind of the same category as Warby Parker or Stitch Fix or some of these other brands, but really more similar to Allbirds. But it does prove that you can have a relatively narrow, focused, newer brand and actually get to pretty good size and actually make some money. Kind of related to that was Chewy, the pet supplies company. They continue to grow pretty nicely, and they also reported not a ton of profits, but again, one of these newer brands following a more kind of traditional direct-to-consumer strategy that is actually making some money. So there is hope out there.
Right on. Now, Foot Locker's got a bunch of news. We could have a whole podcast of news about Foot Locker. They're closing brands I've never heard of, and then what do they call it? A lace-up strategy. They're closing stores. Like it looks like it's all moving in the right direction. But what did you make out of it? Like I said, there's a lot of news coming out of Foot Locker this week.
Well, yeah, I think the reason it's got so much news is that Mary Dillon, who is the relatively new CEO, I guess she's been there maybe 6 or 7 months, formerly the CEO at Ulta. By the way, Dave Kimball, who's been on the podcast, replaced her over there. So she's starting to make moves. She laid out a strategy to turn around the business. The business has not been performing particularly well, but they're going through a bunch of cost reduction, simplification kind of moves. I think the thing that really got the most attention is that they've announced their plans to close 400 mall-based stores across the next several years in favor of either moving those off the mall, which of course is probably something that should have happened 10 or 15 years ago. But anyway, better late than never. But also investing in some newer concepts. They have a thing called the House of Play, which they're looking to expand and or looking to open in New York soon. So it's definitely a business that's been struggling. But what I thought was interesting, aside from just Mary's pedigree of great success, is their aggressiveness of what they're looking to do. So we'll see how that plays out.
I think she's been reading your book or listening to the podcast because she's taken
most likely.
But these are not minor tweaks to the strategy. This is a wholesale. We need to do things differently. We can't let the next 5 years go by us. All right, in breaking news, Bed Bath & Beyond news, the stock slips below $1, but it's still above water, I guess, is on the positive side. What make of you of the latest developments?
Well, sort of good news, bad news here on Bed Bath & Beyond. The good news is they've been able to raise some additional funds. The bad news is their stock has sunk so much that their ability to continue with their refinancing turnaround plan has become a bit more questionable. We'll see how that plays out. One of the other things I thought was just really interesting, some longer-term listeners may recall that when we were first talking about Bed Bath & Beyond potentially filing for Chapter 11, one of the questions was, how are they going to close all these stores without going through bankruptcy where they would be relieved from the liability? And as it's turned out, they are doing pretty well getting other retailers to snap up their locations, apparently because of the demands of folks like TJX, or TJ Maxx, Home Goods, Ross, a lot of the off-price guys really like some of those vacated locations. So that's good news for Bed Bath & Beyond in terms of not having to maintain the cost of these stores where they can't get out of the leases. Looks like they're having pretty good success getting out. So that was a bit of a surprise to me, but good news for them.
Oh, and of course, they took a bit of a different strategy up here in Canada. They just went into protection, so they got out of their leases. They just got rid of that. Now, speaking of which, it was kind of an interesting week because Nordstrom went into official protection here, which meant all the documents are up on the administrator's site, which are super interesting reading, as you know, because we don't often see this, right? A prestige department store retailer going into bankruptcy, there's lots of lists of the people they owe money to, their vendor lists, the story that they tell. It's super interesting. They say in the documents they never had net positive cash flow ever in the country. It's always been underwritten by transfers from the U.S. So anyway, just super interesting reading, and they started their discounting at 5% this week, and people were up in upheaval that it was only 5%. There's nothing anyway, crazy stuff. And another piece of interesting news: Hudson's Bay Company, who I used to work for, they sold their Zeller's mass merch business here in Canada to Target many years ago. Some of the listeners may remember Target's misadventures in Canada. Well, Hudson's Bay just opened this week Zeller stores again. So it's a super interesting development to watch because I don't think I remember brands being resuscitated back that were gone. They've been gone. Zeller's been gone from the market for 10 years, and they're taking another run at it. So, it's a play on nostalgia. It's not a bad time to be a value retailer, so it's to be super interesting to watch. All right, well, that's a quick wrap on the news. Great introduction to the episode. And just before we get to our fantastic interview with Jarvis Sam, let's hear from our presenting sponsor. There are two types of retailers: those that are committed to transforming at the speed of disruption, those that aren't. If you're a retailer that implements significant changes by intuition, you may soon join the Hall of Shame of executives who bet the farm on initiatives that ultimately failed, so, maybe consider brushing up your resume. But if you are a retailer hungry for a better way to gain useful insights on the impact of your store layout, design, and innovation pilots, you need to know Market Dial. Market Dial is an easy-to-use testing platform that emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With Market Dial, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. Validate your remarkable ideas with Market Dial's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at marketdial.com. That's marketdial.com. Well, Jarvis, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. Where are we finding you today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here and join as part of this incredible conversation. I'm joining you from a surprisingly bright, sunny, and beautiful Portland, Oregon.
All right, well, let's jump in and talk about you. Tell us about your personal and career journey, a bit about yourself and the work you do now at the Rainbow Disruption.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm originally from Houston, Texas. Part of my story that I think is incredibly relevant, I was raised in a single-parent household where my mom instilled in us some pretty significant values of topics like freedom, justice, equality, liberation, equity. And it definitely stayed with me throughout my academic career and experiences, and certainly in professional careers as well. So I completed my undergrad out at Rice University in Houston, studying history, public policy, and sport management, where I became more equipped with some of the academic and sociological elements of topics like race, gender, sexual orientation, religious diversity, etc. And I really thought that I was going to go to law school. For some odd reason. I wanted to be a sports and entertainment attorney, and then quickly realized I wanted to do less contracts and less handling of DUI cases for celebrities, and actually more
fixer. Didn't want to be a fixer. I guess he didn't want to be a
exactly.
fixer. Right?
And so I actually went into strategy consulting, and I loved my time with the firm that I was with. But some of the clients that we work with, you got deep exposure to the culture and climate of different environments. And I found myself seeing a lot of challenges with spaces like the oil and gas industry and the telecommunications industry. And so when I got a call from Google to join their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts through talent acquisition, it was a no-brainer for me. And I wanted to reach out and explore a little bit more around how do you create impeccable experiences from hire to retire for talent within organizations. And so spent some time at Google working in Austin, Texas, the Bay Area, and then as an expat in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And upon returning to Brazil, I loved the idea of being an architect of work as opposed to just working in a system. And so I actually moved to Los Angeles and joined Snapchat, where I served as the organization's first ever head of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it was groundbreaking territory for them. For one, being a Silicon Beach company and not one of the Valley-based companies, and then hiring a DEI leader at only 500 people was certainly different than what a lot of the unicorns were doing at the time. But I stayed at Snap for a pretty good tenure through IPO, through hyper growth. By the time I left the company, it was about 3,200 people.
Wow.
And was making significant inroads in global and international spaces. But I left to join Nike in 2018. And it was such an incredible decision. I've always believed in the power of sport to impact communities, that age-old Mandela quote that sport has the power to change the world. And over the course of 5 years, I played a critical role in the development of Nike's DEI strategy, most recently serving as the organization's chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. There's some incredibly exciting times, some pretty tough times in the macro, social, economic, political, and environmental spaces, but really loved my time there. And then in November of last year, I actually made the decision to leave the organization to launch my own firm. I firmly believe in the democratization of DEI, and I don't believe brain trust should necessarily exist just in one place or one institution. And so I launched the Rainbow Disruption with that intent in mind. We work with academic institutions, nonprofit organizations, Fortune 1000 companies, and governmental agencies to help with the development of their approach to DEI across brand, product, and team and talent strategies, all in service of creating congruent yet equitable experiences for consumers and employees.
I guess maybe before we get too deep into some of the subject matter, I'm sure many of our listeners are very familiar with DE&I initiatives, but maybe you could just help us frame the conversation big picture. What would you describe as what DE&I is really about, why you see it as an imperative, and really kind of how it's evolved over the last few years?
DEI really is the intentional effort to foster a space of psychological safety and the creation of a sentiment and space of belonging for all stakeholders that are a part of an organization's landscape. And this can be consumers in your retail stores. This can be employees working in your manufacturing or distribution centers, all the way to executive leaders within a culture of an organization. It is the intentional assessment of the various contours of diversity. Diversity is more than just gender identity, sexual orientation, race or ethnicity, religious identity, socioeconomic status. It's all of those. It's all of those combined and more. It's understanding of experiences with neurodiversity. It's navigating advancement of approaches for communities with disabilities. It's veteran status. And it's the intersectionality that's built upon all of those different contours coming together that create our experience. Equity is so critical in this regard, though, because for years, we as a global community, but particularly here in the United States, obsess this concept of equality. And we see it in legal literature, Plessy versus Ferguson, this concept of separate but equal. We saw that challenge through Brown versus Board of Education through this lens of what equality truly is. The challenge, though, is equality represents this true north of sameness, whereas equity forces us to consider both the different starting points of individuals, how these contours of diversity play out as a collective, and where we as individuals and organizations have been complicit with the marginalization of these communities. That's so critical because it aligns to that age-old sentiment famously highlighted by Valerie Jarrett, and that governments can set the stage and the baseline, the floor, if you will, for what diversity, equity, and inclusion is or could be. But it's up to organizations and nonprofits to push that ceiling even higher. And so DEI at its core are all of those efforts that we take on through the lens of accountability, transparency, empowerment, and visibility to show up and support communities that need it the most.
I'm curious because it seems that, and I think this is a great thing, that DE&I initiatives have become a priority for so many organizations. But the cynic in me sometimes wonders what's the motivation behind doing it. What's your thought around whether DE&I is just, and I think I probably have a guess as to what you're going to say, but whether DE&I is, just kind of the right thing to do, is more of kind of a PR, investor relations focused initiative, or fundamentally it's just really good business?
I think when we craft the binary of the moral imperative versus the business imperative, I think the substance of impact is often lost. There are numerous organizations who oftentimes don't act in service of doing the right thing. And so the moral imperative seems to position this idea of reparatory sentiment that has to be provided to communities. I'm a firm believer in the work and practice such as that was rolled out following periods of apartheid in South Africa of truth and reconciliation. But that's going to require businesses to actually understand where they have been at fault, where they are at fault in the present, and where their future actions might impact that. By 2015, though, when McKinsey released their famed Diversity Matters study, and then subsequent data was used to corroborate that in 2017 and 2018 by McKinsey, by Deloitte, and by Korn Ferry, people latched onto this idea of the business case for diversity because it started to show what financial outperformance and gains could look like. Here's the challenge. If you purely land your approach in the business case, every time you don't see an immediate result from the perceived outcomes of the study, you believe that it failed. And so it forces you even further back on this spectrum. So for example, when McKinsey outlines the impact of organizations' dedication to diversity for women or people of color, and they talk about 27% and 35% greater likelihood of financial outperformance, it led to a number of companies simply going out and hiring more Black and brown bodies and more women into their spaces. The problem is the companies hadn't taken the systemic approach to understanding their own culture and how can their culture receive these people, of understanding where bias, both in perception, confirmation, mini-me, continues to impact the way these communities show up. And so in a lot of cases, it developed a revolving door where the communities were either not retained, they were given a seat at the table and yet not a voice in the conversation that people took seriously. And so you couldn't maximize the impact of the business imperative. Furthermore, I often critique this idea of the commodification of the human body. We've seen what happens when we do that. It was called American enslavement. And so I don't like this idea of simply tying the presence of an individual based off their lived identity and experience to financial goals and outcomes. What's more is I think focusing on this concept of inclusive mindsets and inclusive behaviors. If we think about the environments for which we're crafting that individuals step into and obsess, how do we make those a space where people can show up with a level of authenticity aligned to the values that they seek to espouse within the organization, and we give them the opportunity and freedom, that is, to be decision makers autonomously in what their careers are. We support through investment in topics like career development and career management. That's why we do the work. We invest in inclusion so that it can create spaces where, as we recruit and retain the various contours of diversity that I described earlier, it becomes impactful for the organization from an innovation standpoint through brand innovation and product innovation, and it enables these communities to show up and operate through the lens of optimal performance. So it's a bit of a hybrid of the two imperatives, and yet a whole new context that I think we have to get to do the work effectively.
As I listen to you describing the scope and the scale of what you're talking about, such fundamental elements to society and to business. So let's see if we can narrow the lens a bit. So you've had this experience of landing in a couple of organizations, one startup, one not, and how do you approach driving the DE&I agenda, like from a structure perspective? How do you get your arms around that? Like, what's your first 90 days that you do, and do you set up a team around you, or do you adopt a team? And what's the framework that you kind of lay on top of, and in the work you do today, that you figure out where to start in these organizations to build traction and get these goals accomplished?
Yeah. So, in addition to my work with the Rainbow Disruption, I actually am very proud to serve in adjunct professorial roles with both Brown University and the University of California, Berkeley, and in the business schools for both. Because I think this is so part and parcel to the work of business leaders. And I really view a leader as anyone within the organization that has capacity to influence. And so this can be an individual contributor, this can be an expert leader, this can be a people manager, but it's really important to equip them with the skills to do the work. And so as I'm entering either client engagements or even in roles where I've taken on the full-time head of or chief role in an organization, there's three key areas. It's the strategy, the operations, and then the optimization. To do great strategy work, we have to consider DEI through the same lens and rigor with which we do corporate strategy development, strategic planning, and kickoff processes, and ensure that it's integrated across the board into those various areas. A lot of DEI work and practice can be incredibly programmatic in nature. Things like establish employee resource groups, teach an unconscious bias awareness training, recruit from HBCUs or HSIs. While those are all amazing approaches and tactics that help us to achieve our goals, it's not aligned around a strategy. And so the first piece that I do in the first 90 days is actually understand the corporate strategy of the organization, understand the brand strategy of the organization, the product strategy, and then the team and talent strategy. This helps you to understand, how does this organization do strategic planning in general, and then cross-reference all of those to figure out some of the core themes that are important to the organization. For example, if one of the value drivers or hyper-invested areas for an organization is growth in their international business, you better be thinking about the creation of inclusive mindsets with a sharp focus on cultural intelligence. The way business is conducted in Japan versus Mexico versus the UK versus the United States and versus Canada are very different. And so there's a level of cultural nuance that people who are operating in those spaces in a deeply multicultural and globalized society need to position to think about the impact and influence of diversity. If your organization has its digital business as a big area of growth, you better be considering elements of digital accessibility to ensure that individuals from a variety of different abilities and disabilities can be part of the conversation and can actively engage in digital access to your platform, whether it's a .com consumer site in a B2C manner or professional services offerings that may be more positioned B2B. To do that then, once I understand that, I can effectively outline the DEI strategy for the organization, because I'm going to constantly be tying all of the core principles, objectives, value drivers, and activities back to that corporate strategy, brand strategy, product strategy, and team and talent strategy. When I talk about something like representation, we can't just start or stop the conversation with representation matters. Rather, it's how do I drive representation in connection to the team and talent strategy? But how do I make sure that where our brand is positioned and the consumers that we're supporting and the platforms with which we show our content, either in the form of television or radio commercials or otherwise, are all linked to that core driver that's positioned in the corporate strategy? This is where I think organizations that I've worked with have really seen such impeccable success. And unfortunately, though, it's why I think organizations, particularly now during periods of impending economic recession, are scaling back with DEI organizations, because it has not been tied to the commercial practice of the business. It has not been reflected in its connection to corporate strategy. And so you see it as an afterthought or an add-on as opposed to fully embedded and integrated. We then move into operations, which is really the establishment of the team, the defining of the budget necessary to do it, the defining of what standards of accountability look like for all parties at the organization, and then optimization. that's where we consider every 3 months, how do we measure and monitor the impact and influence of this work, and then pivot where necessary.
So when you think about these programs, very comprehensive approach, is there ones that we should look to that you're working with that, not everyone has the resources of these large organizations. Is there models that we can look to and the listeners can say, I should kind of model after, or at least turn to as an examples? Any ones come to mind? Of course, the ones you're working with, but anything broadly come to your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I'll be at the sides of an organization. There are several elements that organizations can do intentionally to foster those sources of engagement. One of which, helping leaders to educate themselves. There's a variety of free resources that are online to support this work. The amazing work that's done by groups like the 1619 Project, the work of Brian Stevenson and his work to elevate and amplify conversations around the Black community and the criminal justice system. The work that's being done by organizations like ASIF for the advancement of Hispanic voices and Latino perspectives in corporate. The work that's being done by organizations like LGBT Sports Safe and Gender Cool for the advocacy of trans and non-binary youth in sport. There's a plethora of organizations who not only provide resources, but provide ongoing support aligned to this work. The University of Southern California's Center for Race and Equity and their executive director, Dr. Sean Harper, who's a good friend of mine, they have free coaching for organizations to support in this space. There's just so much that organizations can tap into. I'll be at their sides. I find a lot of organizations really venerating some of the big companies and big firms. And I think some of them are doing great work. I think some of them have opportunities for development. Many of them, though, have big PR budgets. And so they can talk about these programs that they've built or run. And yet the follow-up and follow-through is often not there. I'm so proud to see the commitment that organizations made in 2020 to historically Black colleges and universities and Hispanic-serving institutions. But by 2021, how many of them actually reported on where the money went, what students were beneficiaries of that money, and what's more, how many of those students actually have an equitable likelihood of getting a job in that organization? It's not enough to scholarship a kid to go to an HBCU if your people processes are still so broken that once that individual applies for even an internship, they're automatically rejected by a recruiter or through your standard process and system. It's incongruent. It's a farce. It's performative in nature. And so when you ask, where should people be turning to? Obviously, I have to say my work with the Rainbow Disruption and the team that I am building and have built, we do bring a level of expertise across a variety of different dimensions of diversity, across the different landscapes from executive coaching to listening sessions and focus groups to strategy development across brand, team and talent, and product. And, what I think is more, for me, because I do truly believe in the democratization of this work, even if my firm is not the right fit for an organization, I'm happy to refer them to either nonprofit or even for-profit partnerships that can help them to advance their own work in this space. For when one organization sets the stage to grow, I believe that it can help others grow together, particularly those orgs that are either industry movers or sector movers or real big culture changers in the space.
I got a quick question for you, just with your sports background. If the work that you're doing can be thought of as a baseball game, what inning are we in here?
As much as I would hope we'd be singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" at a 7th inning stretch, I can't help but say we're probably at the 4th inning. And here's why. A good friend of mine, Dr. Alvin Tillery from Northwestern University, frequently says, we're as far along the journey as we've ever been in the pursuit of racial and social equity, and yet we still have so far to go. When I think about teams in baseball, the 4th inning is one of those spaces where you're just far enough from the end of the game that you can still take risk. You can launch and iterate. You can make impact that will be so valuable to the likelihood of winning, to the likelihood of an incredible fan experience, and more. But you're also still so close to the beginning of the game that you're still working out kinks. Players are still finding their way. You're still learning the way the pitcher is throwing tonight. You're still learning if the fans are engaged or connected or not. And it's the same in this space. Some companies are still operating from such an elementary or rudimentary space with growing and elevating knowledge of this. And there's not been a ton of collective action where we all come together. And for me, I want to see this done at an industry level. I want to see the entire sports industry come together and say, we are all going to commit to insisting and assisting the NFL in its greater development of Black coaching staffs. We're going to assist the NBA in their development and elevation of more women coaches in the league. We are going to assist brands like Nike, Adidas, Under Armour with the establishment of sports careers for Black and brown youth, for trans youth. We're going to provide platforms and spaces where they can equitably engage in sport by coming together as a coalition to challenge the politics of the status quo that's attempting to deny them access and rights. I want to see retail communities come together that say, we as a community are going to provide resourcing for these folks to grow into positions of retail leadership and or be able to make an effective transition into key opportunities in corporate, albeit what their educational background and experience is. We cannot just operate in silos as singular companies trying to do or move this work. It's incumbent on us to think about it at the broader industry level.
It's so interesting and inspiring. And by the way, we'll be sure to put links to some of the resources you mentioned. I think that would be a terrific gift to our audience. I'm wondering, as we're coming up on our time, maybe two fairly quick questions. I guess we'll see if the answers are quick. They may not be. But one is, are there any, I guess, kind of barriers that you run into pretty consistently, or maybe misperceptions people have about what DE&I is about that get in the way of progress?
Absolutely. For so many years, DEI has been positioned largely through the lens of race and gender. And so we haven't really considered the other contours of it. Specifically around the topic of race, while we've made great progress with our ability to have discussions about race in workplaces, there is still so far to go. And so even with some of the organizations that I have the great privilege of working with, as the topic comes up, you can tell leaders shying away from it or feeling uncomfortable about their navigation of it. And you'll even hear people make statements like, well, can we discuss other topics of diversity without race? And the raw reality is the U.S. was built largely on a racial hierarchy. I would even venture to say a racial dictatorship, wherein we cannot assess the other constructs of diversity without considering the lens of race, given that even if we look to an individual who may be trans or non-binary identified, Black trans women represent the most marginalized amongst us. They are being murdered in cities like New York, Dallas, Atlanta, DC, and Houston at rates that no one is talking about or watching. They are being impacted through a lack of health equity, housing equity, and so much more that literally the law seeks to protect against, and yet no one knows their names. No one knows their narratives. No one knows their stories or their experiences. And so her experience in that regard was definitely more impacted. When you look at rates of harassment based on the research in the workplace, Black identified individuals with disabilities face far greater harassment than even their white identified counterparts. And similarly, when you talk about neurodiversity versus neurotypical identified individuals, the likelihood of a Black neurodivergent individual finding a job relative to their counterparts is substantially lower. And so we have to consider it through this lens in the spirit of the promotion of progress. So that remains one big roadblock. The other piece is oftentimes cisgendered straight white men in organizations may not understand the role that they play in the space. And so it's either rooted in fear of saying the wrong thing or an abject refusal to be a part of the conversation. We inherently begin to otherize communities when we say diverse people, diverse populations, diverse groups. The reality is our diversity is an element of our identity, and yet we are not monolithic. There are so many differences and distinctions in what it means to be LGBTQ and what it means to be Black and what it means to be Latino or Native and Indigenous, etc. And so when leaders choose to operate out of fear and truly exercise color blindness over color braveness, it leads to a lack of ability to engage effectively, and that roadblock can cause a ton of issues in our ability to actually promote the advancement of this work more collectively.
So last question before we let you go. I noticed that you will be on stage along with Mr. LeBlanc here at the Retail Council of Canada's annual store conference in Toronto in a couple of months. And I'm wondering, beyond some of the things you've been generous enough to share with us today, if there's anything else you might add to kind of preview and whet the appetite of the people that might be attending.
Absolutely. Retail employees and organizations represent the first line. They have the closest connection to consumer. Their understanding of the products within our organizations is so powerful and so strong. The rigor, practice, and passion that they bring to the table is oftentimes unmatched. And yet they are often subjected to what I call the prepositional dilemma, where corporate employees may obsess the fact that they work at an organization. Retail employees often position themselves as working for an organization or in service of. This creates a dichotomy of experience where we begin to view retail employees and retail teammates as somewhat dispensable, when the reality is their work is what keeps our businesses and organizations moving and flowing every day. Simply look to the navigation of the COVID-19 pandemic. When retail stores weren't open and almost every organization tried to grow their digital and .com business, they may have seen some lifts in some areas, but it was tangibly felt that without the support of retail teammates and the creation of retail environments to create consumer experience, you lose out on a lot of abilities to be successful. And so for my lecture at the conference coming up, I'm super excited to walk through the contours of impact for how to effectively operationalize diversity, equity, and inclusion in retail environments, looking at both stores context, digital context, and assessing the idea of how do we ensure that our employees feel that they can work both in service of and enjoy the great benefits for advancement as part of an organization. Because put simply, many of our employees are our consumers in retail, and many of our consumers might desire to be our employees.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great way to end things. I may have to get myself on a plane up to Toronto to hear you speak.
Join us.
Definitely captured my imagination. This has been such a great talk. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. I hope everyone will go check out what the Rainbow Coalition is up to. And as mentioned, we'll put some links in the show notes. Such an important conversation, and I hope we'll be coming back to tackle these issues in the future some more. But thank you, Jarvis, so much. By the way, I should have pointed out that with the name Steve Dennis, and Jarvis Sam, we got the two first names thing going, and I managed not to screw up your name, so I feel really privileged in that as well. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. With deepest appreciation. Thanks for having me.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast platform, and be sure to drop us that 5-star review. New episodes of Season 6, presented by Marketile, will show up each and every Tuesday. Be sure to tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn, and you can catch up with Steve and me at the World Retail Congress, April 25th in Barcelona. Until then, safe travels, everyone.